Sanders, Senior Neuroscience Writer at Science News. And it's a big year here for us at Science News. It's our 100th anniversary as an independent news organization covering science. And so, to mark the occasion, we're talking with leaders in the sciences on the big questions in their field. So, I'm here with Sujata Gupta, our social science writer, to talk about stress and resilience and how it affects our brains, our bodies, and even our societies. We're joined today by Dr. Huda Akil, professor of neuroscience and psychiatry, and a member of the Michigan Neuroscience Institute at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She studies both stress and resilience in the brain. And over her wide-ranging career, she's discovered how stress in our world affects our brains, and she's also turned up ways to counter it. Dr. Akil, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll now turn to my fellow Science News writer, Sujata Gupta.
Hi, as Laura said, I'm Sujata Gupta, the social sciences writer, and my guest today is Dr. Brandon Court. He's a psychiatrist and anthropologist at George Washington University and a global mental health expert who has designed mental health interventions to help child soldiers reintegrate into society in Nepal and programs to reduce the stigma associated with mental illness elsewhere in the world. Dr. Court, thank you so much for joining us.
So I'll turn to Dr. Akil first. And I think, this year, this past 2 years especially, we've all heard people say, I'm so stressed out. And we all know what that means intuitively. But from your perspective, what does that mean from a neuroscience point of view?
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. The stress is, of course, a psychological concept that we all experience, and it indicates a sense of discomfort, alarm, sometimes fear, anxiety, uncertainty, and it carries a lot of negative connotations. It is also a piece of biology that we share with pretty much all mammals. It's very clearly wired. We have in our body the ability to perceive the world and encode whether something is going to be stressful or not. And then there are biochemical consequences of this, where that encoding of an event in the world around us or even within us says, pay attention, this is threatening, this is important. And then that information in the brain goes into a final endpoint called the hypothalamus, which releases a special hormone that then turns on a cascade of other hormones in our body, circulates in the blood, turns on a stress hormone in the end called cortisol in the humans. And cortisol is a chemical then that goes around all over the body, goes back to our brain and says, do something. And sometimes the information is to alert you, to pay attention, to act, to run away, or to focus, or to fight. That's the fight and flight response. And then eventually is to say, stop worrying, it's over. So it's a very dynamic response that encodes the information in a biological way and both encodes the beginning and the end of it. And it's a system that you find in a dog, in a cat, in a mouse, in a rat, in a human, in a monkey. It's very nicely conserved.
Thank you, Dr. Akil. So we're going to zoom out a little from the brain to all of society. And I'd just love to understand, Dr. Court, how you define stress from a behavior science perspective. So for instance, I've seen that, there's lots of articles lately about being more mindful, practicing yoga, sort of staying in the moment as an individual. But your work really suggests the importance of community to building resilience, and I was hoping you could explain that.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. And thank you so much, Sujata and Laura, for the opportunity to be here, and happy 100th anniversary to Science News. So concepts of stress and resilience are often thought of in terms of the individual, that something is happening to me. I am stressed out. And I think throughout the pandemic, we've all heard these messages of self-care, take care of yourself, do some meditation, do some exercise, try to eat right. So the idea of it's kind of, this is an internal thing happening to me, and then I'm supposed to respond to it. I think of the hospital where I work, and they gave us all free access to mindfulness apps throughout the pandemic, which is great. But as an anthropologist, I also think about stress and resilience as part of systems. They're part of families, part of communities, part of societies, part of nations. If we think ourselves in kind of an interconnected web, then that stress that's on the system is also going to affect me. But in terms of resilience, it's really freeing to think about that, because the idea is the system is resilient, not just the individual. I've done a lot of work as a humanitarian practitioner in disaster-affected settings after an earthquake, after a civil war. And what I've seen is it's really the community that determines how people respond to stress rather than any one individual. I really loved the comment that Huda made about our brains telling us that the trauma is over, the stress is over, stop freaking out. And that's something that occurs not only internally with regard to our endocrine regulation in our brains, but we rely on our friends, on our family, and our coworkers to say the same thing to us. Hey, you're through this. You've made it through that. You're able to take care of yourself. So resilience is constantly something that we're doing inside and with everybody else around us at the same time, which is why I think it's so important to talk about it right now, because we're in the midst of a pandemic where in many ways we've been cut off from those social connections around us that help us respond to stress and be resilient.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, that idea of kind of looking at this at different levels, you can go all the way into the cortisol released in a certain brain area. You could zoom out to the person and the body, and then you can zoom out to the societal effects and how we're all interconnected. I'm curious how you two see those levels interacting. Is there discoveries to be had at all the levels? Are they interconnected? How do you see them kind of working together?
So, if I may, the question is, um, what is stressful? Let's think about humans in particular for a minute. And I remember when I first started, I would try to do things to human subjects, including putting them in a cold room or um, asking them math questions. And one day, my assistant said, you know, the people who give us a biological stress response are doing it, especially if they think we're judging them about how they're doing on their math questions, not so much how hard the math problem is. And sort of the penny dropped that a lot of it is social. That being judged, for example, is really biologically what's triggering the stress system. And then we started doing studies in animals as well, and we realized how much social interaction is a key component of the stress system. So if you think about the job of surviving altogether, exactly what Brandon said is absolutely critical. You're not alone in the world, whether you're in the wild or in a modern society, and you need to take care of whether yourself or your babies or your property. You need to take the environment into consideration, and that includes the social environment. So, social encoding is absolutely key to, we have entire brain systems, brain circuits that encode relationships, support, hierarchy, aggression, social interaction. So these ideas are completely compatible because the social setting and the biology are all part of that same survival evolutionary framework that we're all living in.
I mean, it seems really intuitive, but I think it's easy to forget that we're social beings. And I'm curious, Dr. Court, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that, the sort of therapist client, you're a psychiatrist, and the therapist client relationship is very individual. And I'm just wondering how you began to look at this as more of a social question, stress and resilience as more of a social question.
As a psychiatrist going through years of training to become a good therapist, we always think about the relationship of that person who's going through distress sitting in a room with me together and how we talk about problems. And you get trained a lot on those skills, and then being able to teach an individual skills to help respond to the distress in their lives. And so for most of my clinical training, that was how I thought about the idea of kind of healing and recovery. But in terms of my anthropological work in different places around the world, I can remember at this point, almost 25 years ago exactly, it was my first trip to southern Nepal to see how people with mental illness dealt with the suffering and recovered. And there I saw a small temple built in the community. There were no psychiatrists, no psychologists available, and people who were in distress, some that we might diagnose with depression, some with PTSD, even some with more severe conditions like mania and bipolar disorder. I saw them come to this temple and spend time together to go through rituals together to heal and process this. Family members would also come from time to time to support them. And although by no means did it kind of cure everything, it was really incredible to see in the absence of even most medications and supports that way, there were still ways to support people and help them heal together. And I've seen since then really great combinations of when you have medicines available, but you also have these great community supports that get mobilized. Conversely, I've seen the reverse happen. In my experience working with child soldiers, what was surprising to me is even though many of them had gone through absolutely awful traumatic events, not all of them really did poorly. Some of them came back to their communities and they did really quite well after such awful things happening to them. But other child soldiers we saw in Nepal came back home and really suffered from chronic, debilitating post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms of psychological ailments. And the difference wasn't the trauma, it was how the families, schools, teachers, communities, religious leaders responded to those child soldiers as they came back home. What we saw in the one communities where they did well was lots of support, welcoming them back to school, help them restart their lives. In another community where there was not support for them coming back, child soldiers who were former child soldiers who were girls were forced to sit on the floor in the classroom. Some weren't even allowed back in the schools. And what we saw was that it was actually the social ostracization, being excluded from returning to society, that really made the difference in terms of trauma leading to psychological distress. And a really interesting kind of historical fact is that although we all talk about PTSD all the time now, that PTSD as a diagnosis really didn't exist before the Vietnam War. It wasn't until around 1980 when psychiatrists in their typical manuals included PTSD, in large part based on research done with people returning from Vietnam, where you had the same process in the US. Some people came back to communities, got a lot of support from their families and communities, but in other places around the US, when people came back home as soldiers, they were shunned by communities, they were not allowed to return, they were mocked politically, and really it's that experience, that social response after trauma that really makes an important determination of whether trauma leads to distress or trauma can be something that we recover from and are resilient to.
It's a really interesting idea. You bring up not just the original traumatic experience, but the response afterward and kind of this really crucial time element. And I wonder, Dr. Akil, you've written this really nice perspective on the kind of the history of discovering the stress system and kind of how these concepts have changed over time. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that progression of our understanding of it. It's not just a simple fight or flight
Right.
discrete event, but it seems rather to be this more kind of interactive, adaptive concept.
So if we step back and think about what the job is of the brain in general, especially as you get to more complicated organisms like mammals, humans, the job is to uh, recognize the environment, cope with it, get the best out of it, avoid the worst out of it. So it is really about perceiving, remembering, assessing, responding, learning, so that you can evolve and even predicting what's going to happen in the future so you avoid the pain and agony. That job sits really at the interface between the individual and the world around it. And that's the physical world, that's the social world. The stress system is exactly that system. It's not genes alone, it's not environment alone, it's a system that assesses the environment. And through evolution, we have multiple mechanisms of how to cope. Some of them are actually defensive. It's, where you just go in a corner and hide from threat, for example. And some are more, exploratory, like you are willing to take a risk because it might be fun or it might be something productive out there. And in a population, there is a distribution of people. Some tend to be more conservative in the way they interact with the world, and some might be more extroverted, interactive, risk taking, and so on. And there is no right and wrong. It's good for the population at large to have different kinds of reactions to the world, of interacting with each other. But if the point of this whole thing is to be constantly assessing the environment, then we can't think of it only as an alarm system. It's not just your alarm that's sitting there doing nothing until a horrible, like the fire, there's a fire or, an attack. It has to be monitoring and adapting constantly. And so I think, and we see that even the level of monitoring changes during the course of the day, for example, and in different settings. So it's a very much alive, ongoing system that does good things as well as bad things. And the good things are this kind of very adaptive, plastic, malleable way of learning. And the more complicated the creature, the more actually noise there is in the system, because the more unpredictable the environment and the richer the opportunities are. Whereas if you are ultra programmed, like a monarch butterfly, it's beautifully programmed, way better than we are, but then the environment can't vary by much. So you build all this kind of elasticity, plasticity, adaptability into the system. But the price for that is it's never perfect. It's always kind of trying to catch up with what is going on. It can do that for short periods really well, and that's what we call good stress, where something happens, you learn from it, you get a swift stress response, it makes you pay attention, it makes you remember, it makes you change behavior and respond accordingly. But if it keeps going and going and going, and there is no relief, either within yourself or through your support system, then it's cumulative and the cost is biological and very expensive and literally changes the fabric of the brain. And so, it again, very highly intertwined with what the environment is doing. And time is really important. So, your point about time, the points that have been made about time, the sequence of event, the duration of the event, the direction that they're going, are they cumulative? Are they letting off at times? Are you having time to integrate the information and restart it? All of that can be seen both psychologically, and we know some biological correlates for it.
Yeah, as you were saying, stress that goes on and on. I had thoughts of the pandemic, and we've all experienced this for a long, long time.
That's right.
And I know both of you have worked with animals, and I'd be curious if you could, compare what you know from laboratory studies. What things do you do to the animals to elicit a stress response, and how might that compare with what we're all experiencing now? You've already touched on the isolation, the long duration, the uncertainty about future. Are there parallels you can tell us about?
Brendan, you want to start and then I'll follow?
Sure. So my direct animal research days are long behind me. I deal with the bipedal human animals these days. But the animal research has really been incredible to inform how we think about this. And I really take kind of a biocultural evolutionary perspective. So the idea of what we're trying to understand about stress, resilience, and healing, we can look across evolution, not just our biological evolution, but also how cultures have evolved. And if we think about evolutionary processes, evolution doesn't just act on individuals, it acts on groups. So we can actually see that especially in social mammals, the evolution of these social behaviors to respond to stress. If we think about kind of healing, one of the best images that comes to mind are, the images that Jane Goodall described working with chimpanzees of grooming behaviors. That if you look at somebody distressed in a group, a distressed, adolescent or a distressed female partner or male partner, that often it's through grooming that people would calm down. Or the chimpanzees would calm down. That was the behavior that formed an alliance again. They got a chimpanzee who was distressed to calm and be able to interact. And if we look at this, it really is a behavior that can be seen across almost all social mammals in some way. A really interesting thing is that in the 1990s, there was a group of Dutch researchers, and they were working on creating rat models of PTSD. And so they would put a rat in a cage with a quite aggressive, larger male rat, and then have the rat go back to its original cage, and then look and see if it had a lot of the behaviors of PTSD. And what they found was that when they were trying to replicate this behavior amongst rats, that they weren't seeing it initially. And they were saying, well, why is that not the case? And what they noticed is typically they were taking the rats and then putting them back with other rats with whom they were familiar. If they took the rat, had that rat exposed to that aggressive male rat, and then put that rat back alone, suddenly a lot of the behaviors that we think of when we think of PTSD, avoidance, hyperarousal to any stimuli, and even the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal stress response that Huda was just describing, that you can recreate all of that in a rat model. But it was particularly in the rats who were caged alone after a stressor that you really saw this response. The other thing is that we can also think about the biology of healing and how that's kind of evolutionary in our past and ourselves now. That there's a whole process that happens when we as a human being, or again amongst chimps or rats or other social mammals, when we see another member of our species or our in-group in particular that's distressed, we also feel that stress. We have our own stress response to others in distress. When that happens, we use our own internal mechanisms to begin to calm ourselves down. But because we're cued to somebody else's stress through mirror neurons and other processes, we then engage with them. We reach out, we try to help. And that actually by giving support, not only does their stress reduce, but there's actually a feedback loop where we get that warm glow, that nice fuzzy feeling from helping somebody else. And that causes us to repeatedly engage in that support of other people. And that's really the flow of empathy in our species that helps us to realize that we're not just alone healing ourselves, but we're responsible to be healed, to heal other people, but also should be receptive to being healed by others in our families, communities, and social lives.
Yeah, so I want to echo some of the things that Brandon said. One is that we have an unpublished studies in animal that shows that effect of community, not only uh, on the kind of isolation after the fact, but even during a stressful event. If we take animals that are genetically have a tendency to be very inhibited and very passive and inhibited, and we put them through an experience that is negative for them, it really matters who else is in the room with them, even if they're in separate cages and pretty separated. The same experience, if they undergo it during the experience itself alone versus in a group, produces very different brain patterns and very different consequences. We don't know how they're communicating through smell, for example, or through ultrasonic vocalization. But we again discovered this by chance because we had different studies and they were giving us different results, and we tracked it down to the fact that whether you're experiencing the stress alone or in a group makes a big difference. It's not only whether also you're supported afterwards, but even during. And it brings to mind what happens if a whole group of people experiences a traumatic event together versus if you're alone when you experience it. So even animals show us that. I think it was very cool to discover, and we tracked down some of the brain circuits that get activated. The other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of healing, but also of um, stress and resilience in general. We've been saying those terms, and uh, who experiences stress and how. And a lot of people might think that being resilient is not feeling stress or not feeling stress as much. And I think that's one kind of resilience. Um, but the other kind of resilience is having counter-regulatory mechanisms to compensate for that stress and rebalance yourself, which I think I hear Brandon kind of referring to in a lot of these cases, like, being in a group, feeling supported. And we've been very interested in understanding mechanisms of stress versus resilience, different mechanisms, biological and psychological, behavioral, both in animal models and in human studies. And in this case, these are college freshmen. And in both cases, it's very clear that, there are genetic biological mechanisms of resilience that we see both in animals and in humans. But that there are environmental mechanisms of resilience that are pretty clearly independent and that will more than compensate for the genetic vulnerability. So we have animals that are very vulnerable to negative emotions. And we also have college freshmen who genetically, when you're looking at their genetic load, look like they're going to be very vulnerable. And we've been studying them through the pandemic, before and through the pandemic, and looking at that interplay between genes and environment and depression, anxiety versus resilience. And it's very evident that you can be very genetically vulnerable and yet socially and psychologically resilient. And that there are people who seem to be very biologically resilient and under normal circumstances, like before the pandemic, they sail through a typical freshman year without experiencing too much distress or anxiety or depression. But the pandemic actually hit them really hard. And it's as if they had not developed some of the psychosocial tools that people who are more vulnerable might have developed in order to survive. And so this idea, and we see that, as I said, in animal models. So there's this idea that there are multiple paths to achieving resilience, as well as multiple ways to be vulnerable. And that uh, genetics is not destiny, and that context really can more than compensate, and that even some experience in being stressed is actually resilience inducing in a way that you don't see if somebody never experienced distress and then suddenly gets hit pretty hard.
That's fascinating. I kind of remember reading these articles when the pandemic first hit from people who suffered from sort of extreme anxiety saying, I'm actually doing okay. I've prepared for the worst. So, um, so sort of related to that, I feel like the pandemic is almost short-circuiting like these coping mechanisms that we have and that we are fortunately able to develop and are, like you said, genetics isn't destiny. But I'm thinking like social distancing, this in a lot of the social science literature, it's like the together apart, And I just am wondering how we can sort of apply these, sort of more theoretical findings to what we're seeing now with sort of these ruptures in society with the pandemic.
Exactly, Sujata. So, and Huda, your points as well in terms of how certain college students responded to stressors before the pandemic and how this has really changed our ways of interacting with others. And to the point of people with anxiety and how might they have responded before, and in some ways it's almost the pandemic was protective in some ways because they didn't have a lot of those interactions. So I think in some ways actually being forced to interact with others and spend time with them, and you think about colleges, college students on a campus or us in our daily lives, dropping kids off at school and picking them up, there are all these little micro interactions that are just reassuring. Back to Huda's point about the experience of a traumatic event. Are you alone or are you going through it with others? And so I think the way that society was built prior to the pandemic, we went through a lot of things together. And in many ways now we've been having to go through things alone. So the question is, how do we find ways to be able to do that? It doesn't necessarily force us into a distressful situation, but helps us feel not so isolated. And in my work, really, it's about kind of the flow of empathy and how do we promote the flow of empathy during especially a humanitarian disaster like a global pandemic. So two things have come up in our work recently that have been really important. So one is the recognition that particular individuals have really been isolated from accessing mental health care throughout the pandemic, especially communities, BIPOC communities, so Black and Brown communities, Indigenous, and other peoples of color. That in many ways those individuals had to access things in person. There was a loss of that, and then having to shift over to remoteness. But then the other piece has been a recognition in the past year that we have a huge disparity in who actually provides mental health services. That the US is 40% minorities, but only 1 out of every 10 mental health specialists is not white. And so how can we have people that have shared lived experience, come from shared communities, shared cultures, when our mental health professionals do not represent the makeup of the American public? So we've tried to find ways to actually shift how mental health care is delivered and shift who's delivering mental health care. So we've taken interventions that we've used after an earthquake in Nepal or after a war in another setting and adapted those actually for use in New York City. And training up people who work in community-based organizations, religious centers, other types of community-based bodies to be able to provide brief psychological support so you have someone from the same community as you able to support you. And we know that that really promotes that flow of empathy, understanding. Back to Huda's point, it's like we are in this together going through these difficult situations. It's not a substitute for when a specialist might be needed or something like medication might be needed, but it's really important for that general level of psychological distress that has just escalated for all of us. But another really important piece about trying to make sure that there's more care and more empathy in the world is also about our divisions in society and stigma and discrimination. That if you look at people who are seen as not part of your group, and when they go through suffering, you don't have that same response of kind of internalizing their suffering and reaching out to help them. There's this German term Schadenfreude, which is actually a even neurobiologically a rather true concept, where you can feel pleasure when somebody who's not in your social group is in pain, right? That something about our evolution made that adaptive, which means we need to find ways to break down those group divisions. And so we've done a lot of work on this in Nepal. We now are doing it in 7 countries around the world, where in particular, we're trying to reduce the stigma and discrimination related to mental illness. So we teach people living with mental illness to tell their stories, to use photographs or video or voice narratives to be able to share what it's like and what they're going through. And then we play these or have these individuals come and give talks to healthcare workers who often are stigmatizing against them. And they begin to find those connections, that idea that our lives really aren't so far apart. You have the same concerns about your kids that I do. You enjoy the same festivals and holidays that I do, but trying to find those connections. And when you create those connections, that empathy flow opens up. So suddenly I feel your suffering and I want to respond in a positive way to support you. So I think the two really important things that we're recognizing as a society now is that one, we need to have a broader, much more diverse mental health workforce to really represent the whole array of different forms of of lived experience amongst us as a nation and as a society. And the second is, what tools can we use to break down barriers of stigma and discrimination so that people are more empathetic, caring, and helpful towards one another, especially when coming out of a 2-year-long, potentially longer pandemic at this point.
So I want to also add something that I've been thinking about, which is I find very unusual about this pandemic. We talk about isolation, which is, of course, the big stressor, loneliness, isolation, and so on. But to me, an important question, and I wonder how we will be able to deal with it, is how we perceive ourselves and each other in terms of roles. For example, I am a grandmother, and before the pandemic, took some pleasure, and I work full time, I'm very busy, but I also took pleasure in helping with my grandchildren to both to connect with them, but also to take some of the load off the back of my, son and daughter-in-law who live in town. During the pandemic, not allowed, right? You can't play that role. So not only are parents of children overburdened because their kids are at home or being sent home because of somebody getting sick, but people in the community who used to be able to help them can't help them. So that cuts both ways, actually, right? It cuts both because I feel helpless and they want to protect me, but the whole nature of who is capable of giving empathy has changed. And who you perceive as a potential threat to you, like a friend who comes too close to you, can be if they're not vaccinated, or if you know somebody who's immune compromised. All of these nuances of our social fabric have changed. So it's not just isolation, it's how we're labeling each other as sources of anxiety, as source of people we need to protect versus people who can be helpful. So roles have changed. And I think it's important to recognize that and re-empower some people and re-support other people who are feeling like their whole entire support system had to be lost because they're protecting somebody else. So I don't know that we have thought this through fully as a society, but it's actually quite pervasive and I think very problematic at multiple levels.
Yeah, you raise a great point. I know all of us have probably gone through those kind of reevaluations of these are my children, but they're also unvaccinated threats to my parents right now. They're how do I assess all of these various risks and
Right,
reevaluate
right. So
how I see these people who have been such a profound part of our fabric.
right. And so it
It
doesn't,
changes
so
over.
to me, one reason I want to surface this is it doesn't need to get all the way. So definitely the rates of depression and anxiety and etc. are going up and we need to deal with those. But I also run a lab with a lot of young people, young women who have children, and I see how demanding that is. And I watch my own children with their children and so on. And how do we socially support them and also re-empower other people who used to play roles and no longer can. And I think it would be really good for us to start re-engaging in how we can uh, create new roles or reformulate the roles that we have in order to evolve that social network that has been completely upset.
One thing we've touched on a little bit, but I would love more thoughts on this idea of kind of cultivating control, cultivating something that you derive pleasure from, that you feel competent at, that you're good at, that you enjoy. Um, how does that fit in with this idea of resiliency, and how important is that as a concept to kind of the human psyche, or even our neurobiology? What does that do to our brain to have something like that we feel good about?
Yeah, I really like the point about Brandon, the flow of empathy as a positive force. I find that in neuroscience and in psychiatry, we think more about the bad things and not enough about the good things. That's not a scientific term, but we think about depression and anxiety and stress and addiction and so on. And we try to take people from a negative state to like a neutral state and say, let's see if we can get rid of your anxiety or decrease your depression or minimize your stress. But sometimes that's not possible. And so I have this concept that I call emotional algebra, where if you have negative, you just need to counterbalance it with something positive. And and the negative could be huge, and the positives then have to be small, but maybe many of them, many tiny positives, sometimes a big positive. But if you can't afford, but if you think that you have a certain capital of emotionality. And it's trending in a very negative way because of circumstances. Why not try to put something into your account that's more on the positive side? And that requires some paying attention to the things, stopping long enough to pay attention to the things that give you a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of joy. Um, and they can be about you, they can be about people around you. So, for example, I was telling you, it's been hard not to be able to help families. So I tried and give more donation to people who are, in need. Since we were quarantined and people wanted older people to be especially careful and so on. Well, what else can you deploy? So different people have different skills that they can deploy or different resources or whatever. So finding things that bring you joy, even even if nobody knows you're the one who did it, but they bring you joy. That's, I think, really important to our mental health and especially important in times of high stress. And it could be cooking a good meal and, you know, giving some to the neighbor. And it could be making a flower arrangement or enjoying the change of colors or doing a good deed, saying something positive to somebody on Twitter. Any of that is all good.
Does that happen?
Nobody does that.
I was just going to echo that, and also that part of, I think, Huda, what you're bringing up, and it's also something that we, I think, as a field in mental health, have had to rethink, are these ideas that the thought has to precede the action, or that the feeling has to precede the action. Often this hesitation of, well, I'm not going to reach out to somebody until I feel like I'm okay, or I'm not going to go engage in this behavior or support someone else or do something with someone else until I feel like I'm doing better. Or even things that, brought you joy before, this hesitation to engage in those because it's like, oh, I'm not feeling it yet. An increasing realization that actually it's starting these behaviors, engaging in those behaviors, especially when they involve other people, that the positive emotion, that well-being comes from the process of doing that rather than preceding it. And just as I talked about with that empathy loop, it's really after you've helped somebody that response occurs. So finding opportunities, just as Huda's saying with that emotional algebra, to be able to do things to help others that give you some type of reward, rather than saying, well, I'm going to get rid of my negatives first, and then I can go out and do positive things. Throughout the pandemic and a recognition of actually throughout our lives, a lot of those negative things are there, and we are not just the sum of those negative things, we are all those other positive things as well. And if my work with people surviving with PTSD from humanitarian conflicts, soldiers, has taught me anything, in many ways, it's not the focus of take my PTSD symptoms away. That's not the goal. The goal is I want to be able to help my family. I want to be able to interact with those around me. If you can give me those tools, some of those symptoms, some of that distress, that's okay, but I want to be able to make a contribution in some way. So I think encouraging others around us to make those contributions, and it goes back to one of the points that I made earlier, is part of our role is not just reaching out to others to help them, but also asking for help when we need it. Every time we do that and tell somebody else that we're in distress, we're worried, we're upset, we're having a hard time, we're giving somebody else an opportunity to engage in that empathetic interaction and that they feel better as well. So that actually asking for help is a sign is an opportunity to improve things for everybody, not just for yourself.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I'm going to keep an emotional algebra chart on our family wall.
Yeah, no, I think I find using economic terms for affect regulation to be useful. Like, do I want to invest that much negative energy in this? Is this worth it? Is this like, it's an investment. All of this is, we only have so many resources within us. How do you want to distribute them? How do you want to use them? How do you want to? And that's the part that is more personal, but can be reinforced, can be learned together, and that I mean, The one thing I want to say is building resilience is a lifelong process. You're not born with it. And you learn from having developed some how to do more, but you also learn from watching others. They teach you how they survive. And so sharing those tools are really important. And then the other point about whether it's top down or bottom up is really important. In Western cultures, we're very used to thinking that everything comes from, to use biological term, the frontal cortex, from thought, and then thought has to lead to action and to feelings. But if you do any exercise, any yoga, any meditation, any breathing, you understand that there is a lot that's biological that bubbles up and changes the state of your mind. And there is also a biology to that, a very strong biology to that. And that in turn reinterprets a lot of things. So we haven't said very much about exercise, but definitely, definitely. And sleeping right and eating right and, everything that your mother told you. But it really does matter, especially in times of stress.
It reminds me too of Dr. Court's point about the grooming and the importance of touch, these sensory experiences that then can calm our bodies and our brains.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it seems like there are just so many kind of sensory things we might think about too.
That's right. Pets. Also, for some people, pets are really important for that reason. So, yeah, I think I mean, it's been a terrible, terrible time, and so many lives lost, and so many people suffering. We will take us a long time to figure out, and the pandemic of mental health is just as huge. But I also think it might be a teachable moment for us as humans, as modern humans, about what matters most, and how to bring together our understanding from the most biological to the most social and integrative and even philosophical. If we do it right, we will learn something and we'll come out of it maybe doing better for each other.
Earlier you talked about this idea of kind of experiencing stressful events might buffer you in the future. It might teach you how to handle it. It might kind of spark a little more resilience. Um, will we all be better off in 5 years, in 10 years? Has this experience kind of inoculated us in some way?
Uh,
Um, is there a silver lining there?
so this is where I go back to individual differences and how different people are in different settings and different conditions. For some people, it will have toughened them up, and when they encounter something, they say, hey, I know I've fended for myself before, I can manage it, I know I can survive. For others, it might have put them really close to the edge, and it won't take very much for them to fall off, or they have fallen off the edge. And because we all start in different places and we perceive stress differently, and we have these different modules within us, some of them biologically uh, programmed, and some of them through development and through experience, and how this has hit different people has been different. So even though in neuroscience we try to understand the brain, the circuitry, I am somebody who really cares about differences, and I think that we need to be very respectful, and some people will get over it and thrive for it, and other people will need a lot of support.
And I was just going to echo that there is so much diversity, and I hope that as we come out of this and lessons learned, that we'll also have more diversity of ways that we heal ourselves and take care of ourselves. I think prior to the pandemic, being able to do therapy remotely was kind of considered taboo, and you had to be in the same room. That hugely limits who has access to care in some way. At the same time, I think another aspect of the pandemic has been how we all think about mental health. I think there was already beginning to be a generational shift with younger people being more open to discuss it. But for anybody to come out of this pandemic and not be able to say, I experienced some symptoms of anxiety or depression or even trauma in myself, I think would not be very insightful or reflective. So hopefully we're also going to be continually opening up the doors to more honest and frank discussions about how we're all doing, how we're all feeling, and the supports we need. And I think the other area where I hope we really come out of this pandemic in a changed way is a more diverse, comprehensive care system that is going to think about every American and every person around the world in a more holistic way, showing, because the pandemic has shown us how interconnected we all really are. And I think, the other thing is the realization that certain things that have been taboo in mental health care, like touch, oh no, you would never touch anybody, that's not related at all. Just as Hood is saying, and Laura, you brought up, like, that's part of our biology. So how do we get things like touch to be part of our healing process? Because we aren't just, free floating minds. We all have bodies, and the bodies are a big determinant about how we're doing psychologically. So I hope these types of changes in realizations will lead to a different way that we interact with others and heal others going forward.
And the one thing I want to add is thinking more about children and development and adolescence. I think, uh, they're not just little adults, as we know, and I have no idea how some of this is being processed by them and how it's all been impacting them. But I hope we have more resources for mental health in children and adolescents, and that we learn how to do better, how to support them. And I am really concerned about how this is going to play out. So I think that they deserve special attention.
And I'll just make one final point on that and kind of hope for that next generation. Is I also think in kids, that's when empathy, begins to be in full bloom, and it's really about cultivating that and using that in their lives going forward. It's sadly something probably we spend a lot more time restricting our empathy as we get older rather than helping it grow. And I think about one moment during the, a couple months early into the pandemic, kids are all at home. I had have a 4-year-old daughter. My wife and I were arguing as one does when you're home with lots of little kids in the middle of a pandemic. And 4-year-old who had learned at school some deep breathing and mindfulness exercises had this little pinwheel that she would blow into whenever she was upset. The teachers had taught her to do that. And as we were having our little bit heated discussion, she walks over with the pinwheel and holds it up. So she could already see in us, we were distressed, we needed some time, and she was there to help heal us. So we got to take care of our kids, and we also need to listen and acknowledge when they're telling us what's going on, because they might be the best messengers for us to be a better society, be a group that really cares about one another.
I agree. I'm so impressed with so many of them who have been like thinking about wearing masks because it protects other people, for doing things like learning in a way that no matter how much you say it in words, when it didn't have consequences, it kind of goes past. But they, I think especially in Western culture, especially if the kid happens to be lucky in a family that is not living a distressed life, they did not have a realistic view of what the world goes through. But now I think they have a better idea, because this is what we're going through and complaining about. I mean, I'm from Syria, and I watched the civil war go on, and those people lived through that, and you realize the world suffers on a regular basis. And having a little empathy towards that is not a bad thing, as long as we can maintain also equanimity and mental health through it, if possible.
That's a really beautiful sentiment. I think so much emphasis has been on like lost academics, and I think we forget sometimes that there's this whole emotional piece and empathy piece that maybe they've gained something too. And I don't know, as a parent myself, that's a nice reminder. So I think that is it from us. Is there anything either of you want to, wrap up with?
Well, I wanted to thank you and say I really appreciated the opportunity. I like the fact that it went from biology to society. Happy 100th anniversary. And, I hope this reaches some people and helps them in some way.
And thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great, Laura and Sujata, to have this opportunity to answer questions. And Huda, great hearing from you. And I think we have our next global mission together to have the biopsychosocial frame of resilience for the post-pandemic world. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, if we've set up a collaboration, great. This was fascinating. I think it was really, really interesting to put together the brain and behavior piece. Laura and I don't always get to work together, so that was kind of fun too. Um, so thank you so much for joining us. And for our viewers, you can learn more about both Dr. Court and Dr. Akil's work and keep up with their latest discoveries in behavioral science and neuroscience by visiting us at sciencenews.org and connecting with us on social media. Thanks so much for joining us.